During the first few days of the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan, back in February 27th, 1996, a peak of deaths appeared in the age group of 10 to 15. The children were usually found dead through suicide, usually by hanging or jumping from heights. However, some were more odd. A few cases recorded children who had begun sawing off their limbs, others sticking faces inside the oven and choked themselves on their own fist, shoving their own arms down their throat. A few children who were saved before killing themselves showed sporadic behavior. When asked why they were going to hurt themselves, they only answered in chaotic screams and scratched at their own eyes. When showed what seemed to be the connection to this attitude, the Game Boy, they had no response. But when combined with either Pokemon Red or Green, the screams would continue, and they would do their best to leave the room it was located in. This confirmed the authorities' suspicion that the games, somehow, had a connection to these children and the deaths. It was a strange case because many children who had the same game did not show this behavior, but only a few. The police had no choice but to pursue this, since they had no other leads. Collecting all the cartridges these children had purchased, they kept them sealed away as strong evidence to look over later. They decided the first thing to do was to talk to the programmers themselves. The first person they met was the director of the original games, Satoshi Tajiri. When told about the deaths surrounding his games, he seemed slightly uneasy, but admitted nothing. He led them to the main programmers of the game, the people responsible for the actual content. The detectives met Takanori Ota, one of the main programmers of the game. Unlike Satoshi, he did not seem uneasy, but very kept. Explaining that it was impossible to use something like a game to cause such deaths, and also bringing up the point that not all the children were infected, he brushed it off as some kind of odd coincidence or mass hysteria. It seemed like he was hiding something, but he wasn't giving anything away. Finally, he did say something interesting. Takanori had heard a rumor going around that the music for Lavender Town, one of the locations in the game, had caused some children to go ill. It was only a rumor, of course, and had no real definite backup, but it was still something to look into. He directed the detectives to Junichi Masuda, the music composer of the series. Masuda had also heard of these rumors, but again said that he had no evidence that his music was the cause. Even to prove a point, he played the exact song from the game completely through with no effects to anyone, the detectives nor Masuda himself, feeling any different or odd. Although they still had their suspicions of Masuda and the music of Lavender Town, it seemed they had reached another dead end. Going back to the cartridges they had seized from the homes of the children, they decided to take a slightly more direct look at the games. They knew that if it was these games that gave the children the ill effects, so they took extreme caution. Popping in the cartridge and turning the console on, the game screen booted. The title screen appeared, and the option to continue or create a new game appeared. When they chose to continue the new game, stats started to appear. They saw the names of the children who had played, usually Red or another simple name. However, the interesting thing was the time played and the number of Pokemon they owned. On every single game, the time was very low, and all of them had only a single Pokemon in their inventory. They came to the stunning reality that it could not have been the music from Lavender Town that had caused such ill effects in the children, since it was impossible to reach that part of the game in such a small amount of time, and with only one Pokemon in their inventory. This brought them to the conclusion that something early on in the game had to be the cause. If it wasn't the music, nor the title screen, it had to be something within the first few minutes of the game itself. They had no choice but to turn off the game now and go back to the programmers. Asking for a list of all the programmers from Takanori, they found, surprisingly, that one of the programmers had committed suicide shortly after the game was released. His name was Chiro Miura, a very obscure programmer who had provided very little for the game. Even more interestingly, he had requested his name did not appear in the credits of the game, and so it did not. Looking over the evidence found at Chiro's apartment, they found many notes written in bold marker. Most of it was crumbled or marked out, making it very different to read. The few words they could make out in the mess was, "Do not enter," "Watch out," and "Come follow me," in bold. The detectives were unsure what these meant, but they knew they had to have a connection. Further searching, they discovered Chiro was good friends with one of the map designers, Koji Nissino, and this was probably the only reason Chiro had been given a part in the game. Koji Nissino, since the release of the game, had locked himself in his apartment, barely leaving in the dark of the night to fetch anything he might need. He told his friends and family he was mourning for his dear friend Chiro, but they didn't believe this, since Nissino had locked himself up the day the game was put in stores, a few days before Chiro had killed himself. It was troubling, but the authorities finally persuaded Nissino to sit down and speak with them. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days, dark rings under his eyes. He stunk, his nails had grown black and his hair was greasy, sticking to his forehead and neck. He spoke in stutters and murmurs, but at least he had something to say. When asked if he knew anything about the children who had died after exposure of the game and if it had any connection to the game, he answered them seemingly carefully, choosing his words thoughtfully before answering. He told them that his friend Chiro had an interesting idea with the game, something he had wanted to try since he heard the project was starting. Nissino himself knew Takanori, the director and main programmer, for a long time, so he could easily get a mediocre programmer on the project with little persuasion. It seems Chiro had convinced Nissino to get him in on the project, and it had worked. The detectives knew they were onto something. This obscure, unknown programmer, Chiro, had to have something to do with it. Something. They asked what Chiro's idea was, why he wanted so badly to have a part in making this children's game. Nissino told them that Chiro never told him much about it, other than a few details every now and then. He wanted to insert a special kind of Pokemon in the game, one completely different from all the others. It would serve as an extra, a kind of out-of-place thrill for the player. It wasn't, however, Missigno, as some people had assumed. It couldn't be. With the gameplay time recorded on the cartridges, it was impossible for the children to have time to have seen that Pokemon. Nissino, throughout the entire conversation, seemed to break down even more with every question. The detectives pushed him more and more, searching his mind for any and every scrap of knowledge this man had no game in Chiro, and Chiro's intentions. It was when they asked about the notes found in Chiro's home that he snapped. From under the couch Nissino was sitting on, he whipped out a pistol, pointing it straight at the police while backing away a few steps. Then, just as quickly, he brought the pistol to his face. Don't follow me, muttered Nissino as he stuck the pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. It was too quick for the police to react. It was done. Nissino had killed himself, repeating slightly differently what was written on one of Chiro's papers. It seemed all leads had finally died. The team who had created this original game was splitting up, becoming harder to find. It was as if they were keeping a secret. When the police finally managed to talk with anyone who had parts in the game, even the obscure character designers or monster designers, it seemed they had nothing of interest to say. Most of them didn't even know Chiro, and the few who did only seemed to have seen him once or twice working on the game itself. Throughout all of this, the only confirmation they had was that Chiro was indeed the one who had worked on the very early parts of the game. It had been a couple of months after the children's suicides and the death rate had dropped dramatically. It seemed the game was no longer giving any ill effects to any children. The callback of the games that was planned was cancelled, since it seemed the game was no longer harming anyone. They had begun to think that maybe Takanori was right, and all of this was just an odd coincidence or mass hysteria. Until they received the letter. It was given to one of the detectives himself, quite directly out on the street. It was a woman who gave him the note, a very frail, thin, sick-looking thing. She gave him the letter quickly, telling him it was something he needed to see, and without waiting for a response or another word, she disappeared into the crowd. The detective brought it into his office, and calling the others in, he brought it out and read aloud. It was a letter written by Chiro himself, but it wasn't one found in his apartment. They had thoroughly searched and cleared out the place, so wherever this letter had come from, it wasn't kept at his home. It was signed to be given to Nissino. It started off quite formal, hello, how are you, regards to the family and such. But after one or two of these normal paragraphs, they reached a section that requested Nissino get him back into the game team, to get him a programming position in Pokemon Red and Green. As the letter continued, the handwriting seemed to grow more jittery. He had talked about a glorious idea he had, a way to program something unseen in any game before. He said it would certainly revolutionize not only the gaming industry, but everyone. He went on to say that it was a very simple procedure to program this idea into the game. He did not even have to add in any foreign programming, but could use what was already given in the game itself. This would, the detectives agreed, make it impossible to notice any obscurities in the programming itself. It was a perfect way to hide whatever this was. The letter ended abruptly. There was no goodbye, no say hi to the family, no write back, or no thank you. Nothing like that. It was just his name, written hard in the letter where the paper almost broke through. It was only his name, Chiro Miura. This was the nail in the coffin for the detectives. They had no more suspicion about the cause. Chiro had programmed something into the early parts of the game. Something maddening. To further increase this streak of success, they discovered that the programming team had worked in pairs, even Chiro himself. He had worked with another programmer, Susuke Tamada. If anyone knew what this secret in the game was, Susuke Tamada would be the man. This was their final hope of unraveling this mystery once and for all. They learned Susuke had provided a lot of programming to the game and seemed to be an average good guy and worker. They were easily allowed into his home, a fair place, and they entered his living room where they sat. Susuke did not sit, however. He stood by the window of the second-story floor, looking out onto the busy street. He was smiling a little. There is no direct witnesses to the events that followed. The only thing from this conversation that remained was found on a voice recorder sitting on the table in front of the two detectives assigned to talk to Susuke. What follows is the unedited recording. Susuke Tamada, what part did you have in the games of Pokemon Red and Green? Asked the first detective. I was a programmer. His voice was light, friendly, almost too friendly. That's all. Am I right in knowing that the programmers working on the game worked in teams? Asked the detective. One could hear the voice of feet moving on the floor slightly. You would be right, said Susuke after a moment of silence. And your partner? His name was... The detective was quickly cut off by Susuke's eerie voice. Chiro Miura. That was his name. Chiro Miura. Another silence. It seemed the detectives were a little uneasy about this man. Could you tell us if Miura ever acted strange at all? Any particular behaviours you observed while working with him at all? Susuke answered them. I don't know him that well, really. We didn't meet up frequently. Only every once in a while to trade data, or whenever the entire group was called up for a meeting. That's the only times I really ever saw him. He acted normal, as far as I could tell. He was a short man, I think this affected his consciousness. He acted weaker than any other man I met. He was willing to do a lot of work to gain recognition. This I do know. I think... Silence. Yes? Asked the detective, pushing to continue. You think what? I think he was a very weak man. I think he wanted to prove himself regardless of this point. I think he wanted to make himself known for something special. Something that would make people forget about the way he looked and pay attention to the powerful mind that lay inside his skull. Unfortunately for him, however, he didn't have much of a mind to back up that reasoning. And, why do you say that? Asked the second detective. Well, it's the simple truth, answered Susuke quickly. His feet could be heard moving across the tiled floor. He was nothing special, even if he wanted to believe so. You can't become greatness, you know, even if you believe it. It's impossible. Somehow, I think Chiro knew this himself. Somewhere deep in there, he knew it. The detectives were silent again, not sure how to steal the conversation. After a moment, they continued. Can you tell us what Chiro's part of the game was? What did he work on exactly? Susuke answered more quickly than before. Nothing important. He worked on some obscure parts at the beginning of the game. A pause, then a little more information. It was Oak's part, to be exact. He worked on some of Oak's parts. When he's seen first, you see... What else? Pushed to the police. They could hear it in Susuke's voice. He knew something. We know you know about the children and the deaths. We know it was Chiro who did it. He programmed something in the game. What are you implying? Asked Susuke. It sounded like he was trying to maintain his voice. We're implying that since you're his partner, if you're hiding something from us, and you could just as well be responsible for those children's deaths as Chiro is himself. You can't prove anything, Susuke shouted. Tell us what Chiro did to the game, they shouted back. What I told him to,